The weird jobs people actually had in ancient cities. Hey guys, welcome back, or maybe welcome in if you're just stumbling here for the first time. Tonight we're going to glide quietly into the streets of the ancient world, not the big glamorous stuff, like emperors on golden thrones or gladiators fighting for applause. No, we're lowering our gaze down to the people you probably wouldn't invite to dinner. The people with jobs, real jobs, often disgusting jobs. So if you've ever thought your 9 to 5 is boring, let me gently assure you, it could be worse, much worse. Imagine being paid to scrape other people's sweat into a jar. Yes, that was a thing. But don't worry, we'll get there slowly. So go ahead, dim your lights, find a comfortable spot and just let the quiet absurdities of history drift you into the soft edges of sleep. Let's begin with the ancient Romans, because of course, they had to organize everything, including the weirdest tasks. Rome was a city of marble and sewage, glorious temples on one side of the street, and on the other, public toilets that were basically long benches with holes. It's always good to remember that a marble empire was also run on human waste. Literally, one of the stranger professions belonged to the fullers. Now, fullers were the laundry workers of ancient Rome. That doesn't sound too bad, right? Wash some tunics, scrub some togas. But here's the catch. They didn't use Tide pods, they didn't even use soap, they used urine, buckets of human urine. The process was simple in theory and horrifying in practice. People relieved themselves in large jars placed at the corners of streets. Those jars were then collected, because why waste a resource, right? The ammonia in urine was excellent for whitening fabric. So fullers would stomp barefoot in vats of pee, swirling around the clothing, kneading it like some unholy sourdough. After a long soak, the clothes were rinsed and dried, and Romans loved the results. White, crisp, fresh tunics, courtesy of the guy who spent all day ankle-deep in liquid gold. And yes, there was even a tax on urine collection, introduced by Emperor Vespasian. When criticized for taxing something so vulgar, he held up a coin to his critics and said, "Money doesn't stink," which is a very emperor way of saying, I don't care if it smells like a latrine, cash is cash. Now, if you think that's bad, let's glide gently eastward into the dusty streets of Mesopotamia. The ancient cities of Babylon and Ur were buzzing with scribes, priests, and professional mourners, yes, people whose entire job was to cry at funerals. It sounds almost modern, doesn't it? Like hiring extras for your grief. These mourners, usually women, were paid to wail loudly, tear at their hair, and generally make sure that everyone knew the deceased was very important. The more mourners, the greater the status. If you died, and only your immediate family sniffled, a little, well, awkward. But if 20 hired women collapsed dramatically in the street, shrieking into the heavens, then clearly you had lived a life worth crying about. And just imagine being one of those women. Day after day, your schedule is basically show up at stranger's house, scream until throat hurts, collect payment, repeat tomorrow. Somewhere between Broadway performance and psychological collapse. But perhaps you're not into funerals. Maybe you prefer animals. Ancient cities had plenty of animal-related professions, and most of them were unglamorous. Take the job of dog whipper in medieval London. Yes, technically not ancient, but close enough for tonight's drift. Their entire job was to patrol churches and whip dogs that wandered in during Mass, because of course dogs wandered in. If you leave the church doors open, the neighborhood hounds are going to stroll in, sniff around, and maybe lift a leg on the altar. So one unlucky man was hired to keep order, armed with a stick or whip, ready to chase out the intruding Labradors of the 14th century. Imagine explaining that career path to your mother. Back in ancient Egypt, though, they had professional crocodile feeders. Sacred crocodiles lived in temple pools, worshipped as incarnations of Sobek, the crocodile god. Priests dedicated their lives to feeding and pampering these reptiles. The job involved tossing them food, adorning them with jewelry, and making sure they didn't eat the wrong human. Though accidents did happen, of course. Imagine working a shift where "don't get eaten by the sacred god reptile" was part of your daily checklist. And then we have the collectors. Ancient cities had a lot of waste, and someone had to pick it up. But we're not just talking trash, we're talking leeches. In medieval Europe, leech collectors were the people who waded into ponds and let blood-sucking leeches attach themselves to their bare legs. Once enough leeches had feasted on them, they'd scrape them off and sell them to doctors for bloodletting. A full day's work was basically get drained, then sell the thing that drained you. They were walking vending machines for medieval medicine. Unsurprisingly, leech collectors often fainted from blood loss. It wasn't exactly a career with benefits. Let's float back to Rome for a moment, because the Romans always outdo themselves. Another bizarre career was the ornatrix, a professional slave hairdresser. Aristocratic Roman women loved elaborate hairstyles, often stacked high like a pastry tower. To achieve this, they needed a team of ornatrices who spent hours teasing, braiding, and occasionally gluing on hair extensions stolen from Germanic captives. Nothing says fashion like scalped accessories. The job was exhausting and dangerous. If you pulled too hard or botched the curls, your mistress might slap you or worse. The ornatrix lived in constant fear of both scissors and social failure, but they also had gossip privileges. Working so close to noble heads meant they overheard everything: scandals, affairs, secrets, which, let's be honest, made them the original hair salon rumor mill. Of course, not all jobs were gross. Some were just strange. Ancient Greece, for instance, had the Caliclion or cupbearer boys. Their whole job was to refill wine at symposia, those famous drinking parties. You were basically a living drinks machine. Walk in, pour wine, smile, walk out. It was an odd mix of servitude and social exposure, because these symposia were filled with philosophers, generals, and poets. So while Socrates argued about the nature of virtue, some teenager was quietly trying not to spill wine on his sandals. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, we had night soil men. This delightful title belonged to the people who collected human waste from cesspits and privies, especially in crowded medieval cities. They'd sneak out at night with buckets, scoop out the filth, and cart it away. It was dangerous work, not just because of the smell, but because cesspits sometimes collapsed, swallowing workers whole. Yes, death by latrine was a real occupational hazard. Let's pause here. Take a slow breath, because you may be noticing a theme. Ancient jobs were rarely glamorous. Someone always had to do the work no one else wanted. The dirtier, the smellier, the better. The chances that someone somewhere was getting paid for it. And honestly, not much has changed. We just renamed some of those jobs and gave them uniforms. And finally, before we close this part of our sleepy stroll, let's mention the one profession that always gets overlooked: the scribe's assistant. In places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, scribes were elite figures. They wrote on papyrus, on clay, on whatever surface you handed them, but behind every great scribe was some poor assistant kneading clay tablets, mixing ink, sharpening reeds. They spent hours preparing writing materials, only for the scribe to take credit. Imagine being the guy who sharpens pencils for Shakespeare and never gets a footnote. That was their life. Invisible, ink-stained, and utterly replaceable. So tonight we've wandered through Roman laundries filled with urine, Mesopotamian, funerals filled with professional crying, and Egyptian temples where crocodiles got better treatment than most humans. We've seen dog whippers, leech collectors, and men who risked their lives in cesspits, all of them anonymous, all of them essential to keeping the great cities of the past running, and all of them probably smelling quite awful. And that's where we'll pause for now. Just rest with the knowledge that no matter how bad your own day job feels, at least you're not wading into a pond to harvest leeches. Unless you are. In which case, respect. Medieval and Renaissance odd jobs, hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've now survived Roman laundry practices and Mesopotamian scream cry funerals. If you're already asleep, that's even better, because that means this is working. But for those of you drifting in that soft middle space, let's quietly step forward a few centuries. From the marble columns and clay tablets of the ancients, we now find ourselves in the stone streets of the medieval world. The jobs didn't get much cleaner. Actually, they got worse. Because medieval people were deeply committed to outsourcing the grossest parts of daily life. Let's start with the glamorous career of the gong farmer. Now, a gong here doesn't mean ceremonial bells. It means human waste. Yes, again. Because history keeps circling back to toilets. In medieval England, cesspits filled quickly, especially in cities like London. Someone had to shovel it out. Enter the gong farmer. These men worked at night hauling buckets of waste out of cesspits, often waist-deep in sludge. They were well paid because nobody else wanted the job. But they were also socially untouchable. People crossed the street to avoid them. Their smell clung permanently, like a bad cologne you can't wash off. And to make matters worse, cesspits were unpredictable. They could collapse, releasing noxious fumes that knocked men unconscious. Some gong farmers were literally buried alive in what they worked with, which is maybe the most medieval job hazard imaginable. Now let's float gently over to another delightful role, the rat catcher. Cities were infested with rodents long before plague became a household word. Rat catchers carried sacks, sticks, and sometimes trained dogs or ferrets. They roamed alleys, scooping up rats, and occasionally selling them back for entertainment, because people in the Middle Ages sometimes paid to watch dogs fight rats in pits. You could say they were running the world's least ethical recycling program. And if you think rats were bad, spare a thought for the leper window attendants. Lepers in medieval society were isolated, often placed in special colonies. Churches, trying to be charitable, built leper windows, small openings in the church wall where lepers could watch mass without entering. Some unlucky assistant's job was to monitor that window. Picture it, Sunday morning, everyone else listening, to sermons, while you stand outside making sure the lepers don't get too close. An ancient version of crowd control, except with much higher stakes. Let's move over now to the plague doctor, perhaps one of history's most famous odd professions, thanks to those beak masks. But here's the thing. Plague doctors were not the elite physicians of their day. They were usually second-rate, often young or inexperienced men who took contracts to tend plague victims because, well, someone had to. The costume was supposed to protect them. The long leather coat, gloves, staff, and the beak stuffed with herbs. The herbs were believed to purify the air, since disease was thought to spread through miasma, or bad smells. The staff was used to prod patients from a safe distance, which sounds clever, until you realize most plague doctors died anyway. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of signing up to be cannon fodder, with a fun bird cosplay thrown in. And yes, the beak mask has become iconic today, but in its time it was more of a last resort hazmat suit. Imagine getting that job posting. Must be willing to risk death daily, look ridiculous, and get paid mostly in city IOUs. On the slightly less deadly side, let's glide into the life of the royal groom of the stool. This position existed in England from the late Middle Ages into the Tudor period, and it was exactly what it sounds like. The groom of the stool attended to the king's toilet needs. He handed the monarch water, towels, and yes, sometimes wiped. Surprisingly, it was a prestigious role, because when you're that close to the king's most vulnerable moments, you gain trust. Grooms of the stool often became political advisors. Imagine starting your career wiping Henry VIII's backside and ending it managing his finances. Talk about climbing the ladder. The less said about what was on the ladder, the better. Another medieval gem, the sin eater. This was a person hired to consume the sins of the dead. The practice lingered in rural parts of Britain. When someone died, a piece of bread or cake was placed on the corpse, then handed to the sin eater who ate it, symbolically taking on the sins of the departed. It was a gloomy, lonely profession. Sin eaters were shunned because no one wanted to hang out with a guy carrying everyone's spiritual baggage. They lived on the edge of society, called in only when needed, and dismissed immediately afterward. It's hard to imagine a lonelier job description. Professional sponge for moral corruption. And let's not forget the executioner's assistant. Everyone knows about the man with the axe, but someone had to set up the scaffold, clean the blades, and dispose of the bodies. Assistants also handled awkward logistics, like holding prisoners still, or making sure severed heads were displayed properly on spikes. It was half janitorial, half stagehand, and as you can imagine, not a job you could really brag about at dinner. So, what do? Oh, you know, tidy up after beheadings. Moving into Renaissance Italy, we meet the strange world of the court dwarf. Royals across Europe kept dwarfs as entertainers, companions, and sometimes advisors. They were dressed in elaborate costumes, paraded at feasts, and occasionally sent as diplomatic gifts. It was demeaning, of course, but some court dwarfs gained surprising influence. One in Florence, nicknamed Morgante, was painted by Vasari and treated almost like a celebrity. But for most it was a life of being laughed at on command. Their job description was basically exist, look different, amuse the powerful. While we're in Italy, let's take a moment for the professional poison tester. Elite households, paranoid about assassination, employed tasters to sample food and wine before the Lord ate it. Sounds brave, right? Except poisoning wasn't nearly as common as people feared, so the job was mostly ceremonial, which means the tester spent years nervously sipping soup, waiting for a stomachache that rarely came. Half guard, half placebo. Still not the kind of job you'd really relax in. Tastes like possibly lethal mushroom. And just when you think jobs couldn't get more uncomfortable, along comes the verger, a church official whose duties included waking up sleeping parishioners during sermons. Picture it. A packed medieval church, the priest droning on in Latin, and you're the guy walking around with a stick, poking dozing farmers awake. It was like being the original anti-snooze button. By now you might be thinking, were there any pleasant jobs? Well, not really. But there were at least some unusual ones that sound more entertaining than revolting. For example, bear leaders. Wealthy nobles loved owning trained bears, parading them in towns or making them perform tricks. The bear leader's job was to care for the animal and lead it from town to town for shows. Basically, a medieval roadie with claws involved, or the alewife, a woman who brewed and sold ale from her home. This was one of the few jobs available to ordinary women in the Middle Ages. Some became quite successful. But of course, if the beer was bad, you could be fined or shamed publicly. Medieval Yelp reviews were brutal. So let's just rest here for a moment. We've wandered past gong farmers waist-deep in filth, plague doctors in their ominous bird, masks, sin-eaters choking down symbolic bread, and nervous poison testers sipping soup. The Middle Ages and Renaissance were full of these strange little roles. Each one reminds us that behind the grand cathedrals and royal portraits, society only functioned because someone was doing the unpleasant jobs. And just like in the ancient world, most of these workers never made it into the official chronicles. History loves kings and queens, generals and battles. But the true foundations of daily life were built on the backs of the forgotten professions. Odd jobs in royal courts and palaces, hey friends. Still here, still awake maybe. But if you're not, that's okay too. The best thing about history is that it doesn't mind being background noise. It's been sitting around for centuries anyway, waiting for someone to notice. So tonight we're stepping into royal palaces, where jobs got weirder, stranger, and sometimes humiliating. Because behind every crowned head was an army of people whose sole purpose was to make sure the monarch's whims were met. Let's start gently with the royal fool, or as history sometimes calls them, jesters. These were not just clowns juggling oranges. A fool in a royal court had a complicated role. Yes, they made jokes, they wore silly hats with bells, but they also had an odd kind of freedom. In some courts, they were the only people allowed to mock the king directly. That sounds fun in theory. In practice, it was risky. If the monarch laughed, you were clever. If he didn't, well, you might not have a career for very long. Some fools were physically disabled or had conditions that made them stand out, which nobles found entertaining. Others were genuinely sharp-witted and used humor to point out uncomfortable truths. So picture it, an opulent banquet, gold, dishes on the table, and one person in the room making sarcastic comments while everyone else held their breath to see if the king would smile. Basically the world's most high-stakes open mic night. Speaking of children at court, we have the unsettling role of the whipping boy. This was a boy raised alongside a prince, often becoming his playmate. But his real job was to take punishments on the prince's behalf, because of course you couldn't whip the royal heir. Too sacred, too important. So instead, when the prince misbehaved, his whipping boy was beaten while the prince watched. The idea was that seeing his friend punished would teach the young royal a lesson. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Princes just got used to the arrangement. Imagine being a kid whose career path is literally designated sufferer. The only silver lining was that whipping boys often grew up to be trusted companions, since they'd been so close to the prince. But as childhood jobs go, it's hard to top the bleakness. Now let's slide over to the royal bed warmer. Before central heating, European castles were freezing. The stone walls trapped damp, the wind howled through gaps, and winters were brutal. To make things bearable, servants were tasked with warming the monarch's bed. Sometimes this meant placing hot irons or pans of coals beneath the sheets, but sometimes it meant an actual person lying in the bed first, using their body heat. Yes, human hot water bottles. The job required you to climb into your boss's bed, preheat it with your own existence, and then slip out quietly before they arrived. Imagine updating your CV with that one. And then we have the royal wet nurse. This was a woman hired to breastfeed royal infants because queens were often considered too important or too busy with politics and appearances to do it themselves. Wet nurses lived closely with the child, sometimes forming a deeper bond than the queen herself, which, unsurprisingly, caused tension. In some courts, Wet nurses were pampered. In others, they were treated as disposable. But their influence was undeniable. A baby prince might spend his earliest years attached to a wet nurse, growing up with her voice, her smell, her affection. Some historians even argue that a few royal personalities were shaped more by their nurse than their biological mother, which is both touching and a little sad. We also can't forget the cupbearer. This role existed in many cultures: Greek, Persian, medieval European. A cupbearer's main duty was to serve drinks to the king or lord, but their real purpose was trust, because drinks were a prime opportunity for poison. Having the honor of handing the king his cup meant you were either incredibly trusted or incredibly expendable. Cupbearers sometimes drank first, just in case, so imagine every sip you take at work could be your last, and all for the privilege of handing someone else their wineglass. Another strange role was the royal keeper of animals. Monarchs loved exotic pets: lions, tigers, elephants, monkeys, even polar bears. Someone had to care for them. In the Tower of London, keepers looked after lions gifted by foreign rulers. They didn't always know what they were doing. Some tried feeding lions bread and beer. Others chained animals in cramped spaces. But still, the keepers lived right alongside these beasts. In Norway, one king kept a polar bear that swam in the harbor on a leash, with some poor soul tasked with tugging it back before it drifted away. It was like working at the world's worst zoo, except your boss was a king who wanted to impress dinner guests. Let's float gently now to France, where the royal household had a position called the Grand Panetier, basically the overseer of bread. Yes, an official job dedicated to ensuring that the king's bread was properly baked and served. Entire ceremonies revolved around it, because bread wasn't just food, it was a symbol of divine order. The panetier had to taste it, cut it, and present it with formality. Imagine dedicating your life to handing out carbs in the fanciest way possible. And then, because we can't leave out hygiene, there were the royal tooth drawers. Dentistry was not exactly refined in the Renaissance, but monarchs needed their teeth pulled just like everyone else. Some courts had official tooth drawers, men who carried pliers and specialized in extractions. They weren't doctors, really. More like traveling showmen who yanked teeth in public squares. But in palaces, they got the upgrade of serving royalty. Imagine trying to keep a straight face while pulling a king's molar, praying he doesn't blame you for the pain. A bad day at work could end with your own head missing, not just the tooth. Let's not forget the royal barber surgeon. Yes, barber and surgeon. In the Middle Ages, barbers didn't just cut hair. They performed bloodletting, amputations, and even minor surgeries. A king's barber might shave his beard in the morning, then lance a boil in the afternoon. The famous barber's pole, with its red and white stripes, comes from this mix of grooming and bleeding. It's equal parts unsettling and efficient. Need a trim? Also, while you're here, shall I remove that abscess? While we're at it, we can mention the royal food sculptors. At great feasts, medieval and Renaissance courts sometimes hired artisans to carve food into elaborate shapes, swans, castles, even entire battles before anyone ate it. It was the original Instagram food, centuries before Instagram. These sculptors often worked with sugar paste, dough, or meat. Their job wasn't nourishment, it was spectacle, which meant hours of painstaking work, only for some noble to slice through it in seconds. Imagine devoting your craft to making a sugar fortress, just to watch it collapse into sticky crumbs. And then, we drift toward one of the strangest and saddest roles, the keeper of the royal relics. Medieval monarchs hoarded bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or even supposed feathers from angels. Someone had to catalogue these treasures, guard them, and bring them out for display. Their life was basically one long inventory list of dubious holy objects. Imagine babysitting a collection where half your items were probably wood splinters and the other half were sheep bones labelled Saint's Finger. But still, people treated it with absolute reverence. So by now we've met fools who risked bad jokes, whipping boys who suffered in place of princes, bedwarmers lying in royal sheets, and cupbearers sipping nervously at poisoned wine. We've seen animal keepers, tooth pullers, bread presenters, and relic guardians. The royal household was not just glitter and gold. It was a machine of hundreds of specialized roles, many of them bizarre, humiliating, or outright dangerous. The irony is that the higher the throne rose, the weirder the support jobs became. Because kings and queens needed everything done for them, and if you pamper someone enough, eventually you invent a position just to hand them bread, or just to sit nearby in case they need a laugh. Strange city jobs and the people who did them, hey there. Still with me? Or maybe halfway asleep by now? Either way is fine. Tonight's story will just keep flowing along, soft and steady. And this time, we're stepping out of the palace gates, down into the crowded, noisy, often smelly streets of old cities. Because while kings had whipping boys and bed warmers, ordinary towns had their own lineup of odd careers, each one stranger than the last. Let's start with something quietly grim. The Resurrection Men. These were body snatchers in 18th and 19th century Europe, especially in England and Scotland. Medical schools desperately needed corpses for dissection, but the law tightly restricted supply. So students and surgeons hired men to dig up fresh graves. Imagine that job, creeping into a cemetery at midnight, shoveling in silence, hauling out a coffin and prying it open, and all for a payment that barely covered the risk of getting caught. Families knew this happened, so they built iron cages over graves, mort. Safes or hired guards to watch loved ones' tombs for weeks after burial. But still, the Resurrection Men kept working because science needed bodies. Morbid, illegal, and oddly practical, the world's first freelance suppliers of educational material. Moving from cemeteries to rooftops, let's float over to the chimney sweep. In the 17th through 19th centuries, chimneys were narrow, winding, and filled with soot. To clean them, small boys, sometimes as young as 6, were forced to climb inside and scrape the sides. It was dangerous, suffocating, and sometimes fatal. The soot caused cancers. The cramped spaces damaged their limbs, and if they got stuck, well, that was the end of the story. Some chimney sweeps sang songs in the streets, which sounds cheerful until you realize most of them were coughing soot while begging for pennies. People romanticize chimney sweeps today, thank you, Mary Poppins, but in reality it was one of the harshest, dirtiest jobs imaginable. On the opposite end, there were jobs that were less deadly, but equally bizarre. For instance, the knocker-upper. Before alarm clocks, cities in Britain and Ireland had professional human alarm clocks. Their job was to wake clients at the agreed time by knocking on their windows with a long pole, or sometimes shooting peas through a straw. So imagine this. At 4 in the morning, a woman walks down the street tapping on windows with a stick, making sure factory workers wake up for their shifts. And here's the strange part. Who woke the knocker-upper? Some said they just stayed awake all night. Others relied on sheer body clock discipline. It was a job that quietly disappeared with the invention of cheap alarm clocks. But for a while, thousands of people depended on a stranger with a stick to start their day. Now let's drift to something a little grosser again. The nightmen of 18th century cities. Remember gong farmers? Same idea, but in industrial-era towns. Nightmen crept through the streets with carts, emptying privies and cesspits under cover of darkness. They shoveled, they hauled, and they tried not to choke. The waste was sometimes sold as fertilizer. Other times it just ended up dumped into rivers, which explains why city water was, let's just say, questionable. The pay was decent, but the stigma was permanent. Nightmen were shunned during the day. Nobody wanted to stand too close to the guy who just spent last night knee-deep in human waste. But again, without them, cities would have drowned in their own filth. Silent, stinking heroes of urban life. Another strange but necessary role was the rat killer, a job that never quite went away. In Paris, rat killers were licensed by the city. They walked with cages, dogs, or ferrets, catching rodents in cellars and bakeries. Some even staged public displays, showing off how many rats they'd killed. Of course, the irony is that the plague had already taught people rats weren't just gross, they were deadly. Still, someone had to fight the furry armies that lived under the cobblestones. And if rats weren't enough, there were also bug destroyers. Wealthy households occasionally hired specialists to pick lice, fleas, or bed bugs from bedding and clothing. This was often women's work, and it required patience, good eyesight, and a very strong stomach. Picture sitting at someone's bedside for hours, poking through sheets and hair, collecting parasites into a jar, and then politely accepting your pay. Now let's shift gently into the world of spectacle. Because cities weren't just dirty. They were noisy, chaotic, and often obsessed with public entertainment, which created some very odd jobs indeed. Take the gong banger in Ottoman Istanbul. Every night during Ramadan, men walked the streets banging gongs or drums to wake people for the pre-dawn meal before fasting. It was an honor, but also kind of a thankless gig, since half the people you woke probably hated you for disturbing their sleep. Imagine having professional noisemaker as your title, or the link boy in London. These were boys hired to carry torches and guide wealthy people through the dark streets at night. London had no streetlights and alleys were dangerous, so you hired a link boy to walk ahead lighting the way. Of course, some of them also moonlighted as pickpockets or lookouts for thieves. Nothing says trust like hiring a stranger with a fire stick in one hand and your wallet in the other. And then there were jobs centered on death. Always plenty of those. In plague years, whole armies of corpse collectors went door to door, hauling the dead to mass graves. They pushed carts, ringing bells, shouting warnings. Some wore masks soaked in vinegar, most didn't bother. It was the grimmest kind of delivery service. Bring out your dead. After the plague years, a quieter version of the job persisted, sexton's helpers. They dug graves, rang bells, and maintained churchyards. Not glamorous, but steady work. Imagine spending your whole career surrounded by headstones, listening to the toll of bells marking yet another funeral. Slow, repetitive, and somber. But not all city jobs were grim. Some were just weird. Take the herb strewers in Tudor London. During ceremonial events, women walked ahead of the king, scattering flowers and herbs on the ground. The idea was partly symbolic, partly practical. The herbs helped mask bad smells, so essentially they were living air fresheners. And if you think modern politicians have entourages, just remember Henry VIII once walked through clouds of lavender, rosemary, and marjoram courtesy of professional herb tossers, or consider the bellman. Before newspapers, before mass communication, towns had men who walked the streets at night ringing bells and shouting news, warnings, or lost and found announcements. Hear ye wasn't just a movie cliché, it was a paid gig. And probably annoying if you were trying to sleep. And of course, cities also had professional cuddlers, though not in the modern sense. In parts of Renaissance Europe, wealthy people sometimes hired bed companions, not for intimacy, but simply for warmth. Sleeping alone in a cold house was dangerous in winter, so you could hire someone to lie beside you for the night, purely as insulation, basically renting a human blanket. Some were servants, others were professionals. It was a real economy of warmth. As we drift toward the end of this part, let's circle back to one of the strangest and most overlooked professions, the water crier. In cities before plumbing, water sellers walked the streets shouting their wares. They carried barrels, or buckets selling fresh, or at least drinkable, water by the cup. Their cries echoed every morning. Some even developed signature slogans or songs. Imagine living in a place where your daily hydration depended on a man yelling in the street with a sloshing bucket. So here we are. We've wandered through graveyards with resurrection men, climbed chimneys with soot-covered boys, been knocked awake by human alarm clocks, and guided through dark alleys by link boys with torches. We've smelled the herbs strewn before kings, watched rat catchers empty their cages, and listened to water criers slosh their way through the dawn. City life was crowded, dirty, and dangerous. But it also buzzed with this endless web of tiny, strange jobs, most of them forgotten now, but all of them once essential to keeping the streets alive. Strange jobs of the industrial age. Hey again, still awake. Or maybe not. Either way, we're just going to keep flowing, moving from the medieval muck into the smoky haze of the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of steam engines and railways, an age that promised progress, but still needed thousands of odd, grimy, and frankly miserable little jobs to keep its wheels turning. Let's begin with something that sounds simple but wasn't, the pure finder. In Victorian England, pure was a polite word for dog poop. Tanneries used it to soften leather, so someone had to collect it. Pure finders walked the streets with buckets, scraping up dog droppings and selling them by weight. Sometimes they fought each other for the best patches of pavement, or followed packs of strays like treasure hunters. It was humiliating, smelly work, but it paid better than starving. And every time you slipped on a 19th century London street, you could blame a pure finder who got there first. Then there were the tosher men. These were sewer scavengers. They waded waist-deep in London's foul underground tunnels, searching for coins, scraps of metal, or anything else of value washed down the drains. Some called them thieves of the sewers. Others saw them as desperate recyclers. They carried long sticks with hooks poking through sludge by lantern light. The dangers were endless. Poisonous gases, sudden floods, rats, disease. But the chance of pulling up a lost silver spoon kept them going. A tosher's life was short, filthy and dangerous. But sometimes, just sometimes, lucky. Not far above them were the mudlarks, children, often orphans, who searched the banks of the Thames for scraps of coal, rope, nails, and wood. Anything they could sell. At low tide, they'd scavenge barefoot in the muck, their clothes ragged, their hands raw. The river stank, the mud cut their skin, and the cold bit through their bones. But every nail, every lump of coal was money. Money meant bread. For many, mudlarking was the difference between eating and starving. Factories, of course, created their own army of strange workers. Among them were the match girls, young women who worked in match factories, dipping sticks into white phosphorus. The pay was tiny. The risk was enormous. Prolonged exposure to phosphorus caused a horrifying disease called phossy jaw, where the bone of the jaw rotted away, glowing faintly in the dark. The stench was unbearable, the pain unimaginable. Yet the girls kept working because there were no other jobs. Their strike in 1888 became famous, sparking early labor rights movements, but until then they suffered quietly, selling matches that lit homes while destroying their own health. another industrial. Nightmare was the powder monkey, young boys employed on warships to carry gunpowder from storage to cannons. Quick, small and expendable. They ran through smoke-filled decks with barrels or pouches, dodging sparks that could blow them sky high. If the ship caught fire, they often didn't survive, and yet captains always needed more of them. In a world before safety regulations, children became disposable cogs in the machinery of war. Then there were jobs that sound almost absurd today. For instance, the leech collector. In the 19th century, leeches were prescribed for almost everything, from headaches to fevers. Doctors needed millions of them, so collectors waded into marshes, bare-legged, letting the leeches attach themselves. Then they peeled the blood-swollen worms off and sold them to apothecaries. After enough trips, the collectors grew weak from blood loss, fainting in the fields. But leeches were money. So the cycle went on. Equally strange were the knocker-uppers, who we already brushed past earlier. But in the industrial towns, they became almost iconic, walking dark streets with long sticks, tapping on windows to wake factory workers. For pennies a week, you could hire a human alarm clock, and they worked until alarm clocks became cheap enough to put them out of business. Now let's step into something a little theatrical. The funeral clown. Yes, it existed. In Victorian England, some families hired clowns to entertain mourners at funerals. It was a throwback to Roman times when jesters mocked the dead to celebrate life. The Victorian version was quieter, often involving men dressed in black costumes with painted faces, walking solemnly in processions. Imagine attending your uncle's funeral, and there beside the coffin is a hired man juggling silently or pulling sad little tricks with handkerchiefs, equal parts tragic and absurd. Factories also created jobs for people too small for machines, trappers in coal mines. These were children whose sole duty was to sit in darkness, opening and closing ventilation, doors when carts passed, hours at a time in pitch black, with only rats for company. Many were 5 or 6 years old. They sat silently, waiting, breathing coal dust. That was their entire shift. The industrial world didn't waste energy on candles for children. Not. All strange jobs were deadly. Some were simply odd. Consider the herb woman of London markets, paid by households to collect bundles of plants to ward off bad airs. She was part doctor, part grocer, part folk magician. Some sold lavender sachets to tuck in drawers. Others sold sprigs of rosemary for funerals. An entire microeconomy of herbal superstition, or the tooth puller, who set up in public squares with pliers, pulling aching teeth in front of crowds. Sometimes they dressed as entertainers, playing music while yanking molars. Pain and spectacle combined. One of the eeriest jobs was the sin-eater. Found in rural parts of Britain and Wales, sin-eaters were paid to take on the sins of the dead. They sat by the corpse, ate bread and drank ale placed on the body, and symbolically absorbed the soul's sins. It was a lonely, despised profession. People shunned them in life, but needed them in death. Every community had one, or whispered about one. And when the sin-eater finally died and who ate his sins, the industrial world also gave us the lamplighter. Before electricity, entire cities depended on men with long poles and ladders to light gas lamps at dusk and put them out at dawn. Imagine walking the streets every evening, one flame at a time, until the city glowed. Then retracing your steps in the morning to snuff them out. It was steady work, but also a race against fading daylight. And perhaps one of the strangest professions of all, the mutes. These were professional mourners hired for funerals. Dressed in black with solemn expressions, they walked slowly behind coffins, saying nothing. Some carried staffs draped in black cloth. Others simply stood at the door of the dead person's home, a living symbol of grief for hire. The more mutes at your funeral, the more respectable your death looked. Grief commodified. So here we are, drifting through an age of coal smoke and candlelight. An age where dog dung became pure, where boys crawled through mines in the dark, where women lost their jaws to matches, and where leech collectors staggered home faint and bleeding. The Industrial Revolution promised progress, but for many, it delivered nothing but stranger and harder work. Strange jobs beyond Europe. Let's begin in Japan. For centuries, there was the blind masseur. In Japan, blindness often meant exclusion from most jobs, but blind men and women built entire guilds around massage and acupuncture. They carried wooden staffs, tapping their way through towns, offering their hands as medicine. It wasn't just a job, it became a respected tradition. Some whispered that their lack of sight sharpened their touch, making them better healers. Yet the job carried a darker side. Blind guilds were often controlled by strict hierarchies, and many members were forced into poverty if they didn't find patrons. Still, the sound of the tapping staff on a nighttime street was unmistakable. The blind masseur, passing quietly in search of work. From there, let's wander to India. Here, one of the most enduring professions was that of the snake charmer. With flutes in hand, men sat cross-legged before baskets, coaxing cobras into rising and swaying. It looked like magic, a dance between man and serpent. In reality, the snakes were deaf. They followed movement, not music. The performance was illusion, but an illusion strong enough to feed entire families. Snake charmers were both feared and admired. They dealt with venom but also with spirits, because in villages, snakes were seen as sacred beings. To control, one meant you had some measure of divine power. Even today, echoes of this strange craft survive, though laws and modernity have almost erased them. Next, we step into China. Here, for centuries, there was the grim role of the imperial eunuch. Young boys castrated, raised to serve the palace. Without families of their own, they became the most loyal and the most feared servants of emperors. Some were reduced to little more than slaves. Others rose to immense power, whispering into the emperor's ear, controlling entire courts from behind silken screens. It was a job that demanded the ultimate sacrifice of the body. And yet, for many poor families, offering a son to the palace as a eunuch was a desperate chance at survival. A life of shame, perhaps, but also of possibility. From palaces to deserts, let's move to North Africa. Here we find the griot, a living library. Griots were storytellers, singers, historians, carrying centuries of knowledge in memory alone. They knew genealogies, wars, proverbs, songs of praise, and tales of warning. In kingdoms where paper was rare, griots were the books. To be a griot was to never belong entirely to yourself. You belonged to your people's memory. When a king rose, you sang his story. When he fell, you carried his shame. Some griots were celebrated, others were feared. But without them, entire histories would have been lost to silence. Let's drift now to Mesoamerica. Before the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs had a profession that sounds almost mythic, the flower seller of sacrifice. At great temple festivals, ordinary men and women carried flowers, garlands of marigolds, lilies and roses, to decorate altars where sacrifices were performed. The flowers softened the horror, turning ritual death into a theater of color and fragrance. It was not a job in the modern sense, but it was a role. families who grew flowers, vendors who sold them, priests who demanded them. To supply, flowers to a temple was both profitable and sacred, blood and petals side by side. And now to the Middle East. Here we find the mourners for hire, a tradition stretching back thousands of years. Women were paid to weep loudly at funerals, tearing their clothes, scratching their faces, throwing dust into their hair. The louder the wailing, the more honored the dead. It was performance, but it was also sacred duty. Some mourners were professionals, moving from funeral to funeral, crying on command. To neighbors it may have looked theatrical, but to grieving families it gave voice to the sorrow too heavy to bear alone. Let's turn briefly to South America, where the Andes had the ice collectors. Long before refrigeration, men climbed dangerous peaks to cut blocks of ice, hauling them down on llamas. In the markets, these blocks were sold to cool drinks, to preserve food, to heal the sick. Ice was wealth, but to get it meant braving thin air, avalanches, and frostbite. The work was brutal, and yet generations of men carried ice from mountains to markets, feeding cities with frozen breath. Now, to West Africa again, this time for something eerie, the fetish priest. In some villages, priests were paid to curse enemies, to bless crops, or to cleanse bad luck. They wore bones, feathers, musks, carrying jars filled with powders, herbs, and sometimes stranger things. Whether they truly believed in their craft, or simply performed it for coin, the effect was the same: fear or obedience. The fetish priest was a job wrapped in superstition, half magician, half negotiator between man and spirit. Let's move east into Mongolia, where shamans roamed the steppes. They were healers, guides, and fortune tellers. Paid in horses, milk, or meat, they banged drums and inhaled smoke, entering trances to speak with spirits. Some wore cloaks of iron and bells, rattling like storm clouds. To be a shaman wasn't always a choice. It was a calling. Spirits chose their servants, often through visions or madness. Refusing meant sickness. Accepting meant power, and the burden of forever living between worlds. Finally, let's glance at the Pacific Islands. Here, a strange but vital role was the navigator priest. Before compasses, men memorized the stars, winds, and waves, steering canoes across thousands of miles of open sea. Navigation was sacred, secret knowledge, passed from master to apprentice. These men were not just sailors, they were priests, guiding entire peoples across oceans. Their job was to ensure survival. Failure meant death for all. So across the world, from the blind masseurs of Japan to the griots of Africa, from snake charmers in India to ice collectors in the Andes, strange professions shaped entire cultures. Some brought dignity, others brought horror. Some faded into history, while a few still whisper through the cracks of modern life. Wherever humans lived, there were jobs that balanced between survival, belief, and imagination. The dark professions of Victorian Europe. Let us step now into London, Paris, and the great cities of Europe. The gas lamps flicker, the carriages rattle over cobblestones, and in the alleys, strange professions bloom like poisonous flowers. The Pais resurrection. Men perhaps the most infamous were the resurrection men, the body snatchers. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine was hungry for corpses. Universities needed them to teach anatomy, to train surgeons, to explore the mysteries of the body. But the law allowed very few bodies to be given to science. So where would they come from? From the earth itself. Resurrection men worked by lantern, light creeping into cemeteries at night. They dug shallow graves, pried open coffins, and hauled fresh corpses out. It was said they worked quickly, sometimes in teams of 3. One dug, one kept watch, and one lifted the body. They left behind clothes and coffins, taking only the corpse, for it was the flesh that fetched money. The work was foul, dangerous, and despised. If caught, they were beaten by mobs, dragged before courts, sometimes even killed. Yet the demand was high, and the money tempting. Whole gangs in Edinburgh and London lived on this trade. The most notorious were Burke and Hare, who went further. Tired of digging, they began supplying fresh bodies by murder. They lured the poor, suffocated them, and sold their corpses to the surgeons. For a while, the doctors asked no questions. It was only when suspicion grew that the horror was uncovered. The public outrage led to new laws, allowing unclaimed corpses from hospitals and workhouses to be used legally. But until then, the resurrection men haunted Europe's graveyards like hungry shadows, the freak show. And then there were those who turned the human body itself into a spectacle, the freak show performers. In Victorian times, the public was obsessed with difference, with the tall, the small, the twisted, the hairy, the strange. Circuses and traveling shows gathered people with rare conditions, giants and dwarfs, bearded women, Siamese twins, people covered in tattoos or with unusual talents. To the audience, it was amusement, horror, and fascination all at once. For the performers, it was survival. Society shunned them. Few could find work. In the freak show, they could earn money, sometimes even fame. Some became stars. Charles Stratton, General Tom Thumb, only 3 feet tall, performed before royalty. Julia Pastrana, born with thick hair covering her face, sang and danced before curious crowds. Yet behind the curtains, life was often cruel. Many were exploited, displayed like animals, denied dignity. Their managers grew rich while they lived in poverty. Still, for some, the freak show was paradoxically a place of belonging. Among others who were different, they found community. They turned mockery into a living, reclaiming power in a world that treated them as monsters. The rat catchers, now let us go below the streets, London, Paris, Berlin, all were plagued with rats. They infested homes, markets, even the sewers, and so arose the profession of the rat catcher. Rat catchers prowled alleys with dogs, ferrets, and sacks. They trapped rodents with poison or cunning, but not all killed them. Many sold live rats to taverns, where men bet money on how many dogs could kill in an hour. Rat baiting was brutal sport, and rat catchers supplied it. Some also turned rat catching into performance. Jack Black, Queen Victoria's rat catcher, painted himself in colorful uniforms, showing off captured rats like trophies. He bred fancy rats as pets, beginning a curious tradition that still survives today. It was dirty, dangerous work. Rats carried disease, bites were common. But in a city overrun, the rat catcher was both reviled and strangely necessary, the leech collectors. We cannot forget the leech collectors. In the early 19th century, doctors believed in bleeding patients to balance the humors. Leeches were in constant demand. And so women and men waded into marshes and ponds, letting the creatures fasten onto their legs. They carried jars filled with writhing leeches, selling them to apothecaries and hospitals. It was grueling. The collectors often grew sick from loss of blood or from infections caused by the bites. Some even allowed their children to wade with them, tiny legs covered in feeding parasites. But the trade paid, and so they endured. The crossing sweepers now picture the busy streets of London. Mud, horse dung, refuse, filth everywhere. For a lady in a long dress, crossing the road was a nightmare. Enter the crossing sweeper. Children, often orphans armed with brooms, kept little sections of road clear. For a penny or two, they swept. Fair path for the wealthy. It was humiliating work, but for many it meant the difference between hunger and survival. Some sweepers were beaten by rivals. Others formed bonds with local communities, even becoming beloved fixtures of a neighborhood. Dickens himself immortalized them in his stories. The knocker-uppers. In a time before alarm clocks, how did workers wake on time for the mills, the factories, the railways? They hired a knocker-upper. This profession was simple, almost comical, armed with a long stick, sometimes tipped with wire or pea shooters. Knocker-uppers tapped on bedroom windows until their clients stirred. For a few pennies a week, they ensured the city awoke. Some worked whole streets memorizing which houses needed rousing at which hour. In a way, they were human alarm clocks, walking the grey dawns, tapping glass. The profession survived well, into the 20th century, fading only when cheap clocks became common. The bone grubbers and pure finders. Even in death, the city found ways to use the body. We spoke of pure finders before, gathering dog dung for tanners. But there were also bone grubbers, the poor who scavenged carcasses. Bones were valuable, sold to make buttons, glue, and fertilizer. Rag pickers gathered cloth, while others scraped grease from sewers. Nothing was wasted. Poverty turned every scrap into trade. The curiosity sellers, and finally let us step into the strange world of the curiosity seller. In Victorian cities, natural history and science were fashionable. Middle-class homes wanted cabinets of curiosities. Shells, feathers, stuffed animals, odd bones, exotic insects. Curiosity sellers scoured docks, markets, even graves. Some bought preserved specimens from sailors. Others dug up old skulls to sell to collectors. Shops were filled with jars of pickled snakes, fossil fragments, Egyptian trinkets, some real, many fake. It was half science, half spectacle. A fascination with the world's wonders, mixed with fraud and exploitation. The public couldn't tell the difference, and perhaps they didn't care. So Victorian Europe teemed with these twilight trades, body snatchers stealing from graves, freaks displayed as marvels, rat catchers boasting of trophies, leech collectors, bleeding in ponds, children sweeping dung, men tapping windows at dawn, bone grubbers pouring through carcasses, curiosity sellers peddling death in jars. It was a world both cruel and creative, where poverty and progress intertwined. A world that turned the strangest of labors into survival. The twilight professions of the Victorian poor, the matchstick girls in the factories of London, young women, some only children, worked as matchstick makers. They sat for long hours, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus paste, drying them, boxing them, repeating endlessly. It seemed harmless, but it was poison. The fumes seeped into their bodies, rotting the jawbones. The disease was called phossy jaw. At first the teeth ached, then the jaw swelled, then bone itself decayed, leaving open wounds that glowed faintly in the dark. The girls endured pain, shame, and often early death. For years their plight was ignored. They were cheap labor, easily replaced. Only after strikes and protests did laws slowly change, banning white phosphorus. The matchstick girls remind us of how industry consumed not just coal and iron, but human lives themselves. The Tosher, kings of the sewers, now down. Into the darkness, London's sewers. The Tosher was a scavenger of the underworld. By lantern light, carrying long poles and sacks, they waded waist-deep through filth, searching for treasure washed down drains. Coins, trinkets, lost jewelry. Toshers knew the sewers like cartographers. They marked secret entrances, mapped tunnels, in memory, even carried fierce dogs to guard them from rival gangs. But the dangers were endless: sudden floods, poisonous gases, or collapses. Some never emerged again. Yet the lucky Tosha could make more in a night than a laborer in weeks. There were whispered stories of men who found handfuls of gold. Most found only scraps of copper, but still enough to live. In a city where waste was constant, the Tosha turned rot into livelihood. The mudlarks along the Thames, another breed, worked. The mudlarks, children, old women, crippled men. They scoured the muddy banks at low tide, barefoot in slime, digging with bare hands. They searched for coal, nails, rope, bits of wood, anything that could be resold. The stench was overpowering. The mud was laced with sewage, dead animals, even human remains. Cuts easily turned to deadly infections. But for the mudlark, each scrap of metal was a meal. Dickens wrote of them, describing their ragged figures crouched on the black mud. The word became almost a synonym for poverty itself. Yet even here, there was resilience. Some mudlarks formed informal gangs, sharing finds, helping one another survive the tide. The pure finders revisited. We have spoken of them before, but let us look closer. The pure finder collected dog dung, pure, for the tanners who softened hides. They carried buckets and sacks, their hands perpetually soiled, the stench following them everywhere. The work was despised, but strangely steady. Dogs were everywhere, and dung was plentiful. Tanners paid by weight, so pure finders were seen crouched in gutters, scraping carefully, or following dogs at a distance, waiting for the prize. It was said you could always tell a pure finder, not just by smell, but by the way people recoiled when they entered a room. They lived on society's edge, trading shame for coins. The night soil. Men more foul still were the night soil men. Before modern plumbing, cesspits filled beneath houses. Someone had to empty them. And so at night, gangs arrived with shovels and carts hauling away tons of human waste. They worked in silence, sometimes waist-deep in filth, carrying buckets up narrow stairs. The stench was unimaginable, but the pay was higher than many trades. Still, they were shunned, rarely spoken to, never touched. They were both essential and despised, laboring invisibly to keep cities from drowning in their own excrement. The knocker-uppers, revisited with rivalries. Earlier, we met the knocker-uppers, those human alarm clocks. But their world too had drama. Some guarded their roots jealously. Rival knocker-uppers would sabotage one another, waking clients too early or too late to steal business. A careless tap could break a window, leading to angry customers, and not all used sticks. Some used pea shooters, firing dried peas against glass with uncanny accuracy. The sound carried just enough to wake the sleeper without disturbing neighbors. In some towns, knocker-uppers became minor celebrities, remembered long after their profession vanished. Their sticks and pea shooters were passed down like relics. The crossing sweepers, revisited with dangers. Crossing sweepers were often children, but their world was rough. They fought for good street corners, beating rivals with sticks or fists. Carriages sometimes struck them, leaving broken bones or death. Police harassed them, calling them beggars. Yet some crossing sweepers grew beloved by the wealthy. A kind smile, a polite bow, a bit of charm. These children became almost mascots of their neighborhood. Some were adopted by patrons, lifted from the street. Most, however, lived short, harsh lives, remembered only as shadows in the fog. The resurrection men, echoes in memory. Even after the Anatomy Act made body snatching less profitable, fear lingered. Families built mort safes, iron cages over graves, to deter thieves. Watchmen patrolled cemeteries with muskets. In some villages, bells were attached to coffins, not to guard against thieves, but in case the dead were not truly dead. To be buried alive was a terror as great as having one's body stolen. The resurrection men had passed, but the unease they left behind haunted the Victorian mind. The chimney sweeps. We cannot leave without mentioning the chimney sweeps. Children, often orphans, climbed narrow flues, scraping soot with bare hands. They coughed constantly, lungs scarred by dust. Many became deformed from years of crawling through cramped spaces. Some were forced with fire, straw lit below them, smoke rising, until they climbed higher in panic. They were pitiful figures, black with soot, eyes peering from dark faces. Society pitied them, yet kept using them until laws finally banned child sweeps. By then, countless had died, fallen, suffocated, or simply wasted away. The match sellers and flower girls at night, the poorest of the poor, became hawkers. Girls sold matches on street corners, their tiny bundles worth only pennies. Some sold flowers, their voices thin against the roar of the city. Many were orphans, their bare feet blue with cold. Dickens and others immortalized them, but in reality, most went unnoticed. They were ghosts of the street, offering roses, violets, or matches to passers-by who rarely met their eyes. The workhouse horrors, and above all, hovered the workhouse. For those too weak to sweep crossings or dive in mud, the workhouse loomed. As the last refuge, families were torn apart, men to one wing, women to another, children separated. Days were filled with crushing labor, breaking stones, picking oakum, weaving, scrubbing. The food was thin gruel, the rooms bare. To enter a workhouse was to lose one's freedom, one's dignity. It was called relief, but it felt like punishment. So many preferred the streets, pure finders, mudlarks, tosher men, anything but the shame of the workhouse. Closing of part. Doubtless the Victorian city was alive with twilight professions. Matchstick girls glowing with poison, toshers wading the sewers, mudlarks digging the Thames, chimney sweeps crawling through soot, crossing sweepers fighting for pennies, night soil men hauling waste, pure finders scraping filth, knocker-uppers tapping windows at dawn. Each lived where society's light dimmed, turning misery into survival. Their stories were not of progress or invention, but of endurance. They remind us that beneath every empire of wealth and power lies a foundation of unseen labor, often paid in suffering. Even after the Anatomy Act made body snatching less profitable, fear lingered. Families built mort safes, iron cages over graves to deter thieves. Watchmen patrolled cemeteries with muskets. In some villages, bells were attached to coffins, not to guard against thieves, but in case the dead were not truly dead. To be buried alive was a terror as great as having one's body stolen. The resurrection men had passed, but the unease they left behind haunted the Victorian mind. The chimney sweeps. We cannot leave without mentioning the chimney sweeps. Children, often orphans, climbed narrow flues, scraping soot with bare hands. They coughed constantly, lungs scarred by dust. Many became deformed from years of crawling through cramped spaces. Some were forced with fire, straw lit below them, smoke rising, until they climbed higher in panic. They were pitiful figures, black with soot, eyes peering from dark faces. Society pitied them, yet kept using them until laws finally banned child sweeps. By then, countless had died, fallen, suffocated, or simply wasted away. The match sellers and flower girls at night, the poorest of the poor, became hawkers. Girls sold matches on street corners, their tiny bundles worth only pennies. Some sold flowers, their voices thin against the roar of the city. Many were orphans, their bare feet blue with cold. Dickens and others immortalized them, but in reality, most went unnoticed. They were ghosts of the street, offering roses, violets, or matches to passers-by who rarely met their eyes. The workhouse horrors, and above all, hovered the workhouse. For those too weak to sweep crossings or dive in mud, the workhouse loomed as the last refuge. Families were torn apart, men to one wing, women to another, children separated. Days were filled with crushing labor, breaking stones, picking oakum, weaving, scrubbing. The food was thin gruel, the rooms bare. To enter a workhouse was to lose one's freedom, one's dignity. It was called relief, but it felt like punishment. So many preferred the streets, pure finders, mudlarks, tosher men, anything but the shame of the workhouse. The mystics, the mourners, and the macabre, the spiritualist mediums by the mid-1800s, spiritualism had swept across Europe and America. People gathered in candlelit parlors to hear raps, knocks, whispers from the dead, and at the center of it all were the mediums. Some were women draped in veils, their eyes rolling back as spirits spoke through them. Others were men in dark suits, calling forth voices from the beyond. They summoned tables that shook, trumpets that floated, writing boards that scribbled by unseen hands. For the grieving Victorians, it was irresistible. In an age of science, factories and iron, they longed for mystery, for proof that death was not the end. The mediums offered comfort, but not all was honest. Many used trickery, hidden wires, assistance in darkened rooms, ventriloquism. The exposure of fraud was constant, yet belief persisted. Even great thinkers like Arthur Conan Doyle swore the spirits were real. The profession of the medium was half theater, half religion, and fully Victorian. The death photographers, another. Eerie profession was that of the post-mortem photographer. Cameras were rare and costly, and many poor families could not afford portraits while loved ones lived. But when death came, they sometimes scraped together coins for a single photograph, to remember forever. The photographers arranged the dead as if still alive. A child might be posed with toys, eyes painted open on the photograph's surface. A mother might be seated in a chair, her family gathered around, hands touching her still body. The photos look peaceful but unsettling. Today they strike us as macabre. For Victorians they were precious keepsakes, proof of love, memory against forgetting. It was a profession born of grief and of a society unafraid to face death directly. The professional mourners in poorer quarters. Grief was loud and public. Families sometimes hired professional mourners, women who wept, wailed, tore their clothes, and followed the coffin with dramatic sorrow. It may seem false, but in many cultures, including Victorian London's immigrant districts, such display was believed to honor the dead more than silence. A funeral without noise was seen as shameful. Mourners earned small wages, but their job was crucial, to embody grief when families were too weak, too poor, or too few in number to make a grand procession. Thus, sorrow itself became a trade. The gravediggers always there, though rarely spoken of, were the gravediggers. They labored with spades, sometimes in frozen ground, sometimes in floods, always in mud. Graves had to be dug quickly, often in overcrowded cemeteries where earth was turned again and again. The gravedigger was both feared and respected. He worked closest to death, his hands black with soil, his boots sinking in the damp earth. Some whistled as they worked, others drank heavily to forget. It was a profession eternal, stretching from Hamlet's Denmark to Victorian London's cholera pits. A man with a shovel, carving space for memory. The taxidermists of memory another. Curious trade. Taxidermy. Victorians adored stuffed animals. Parlor displays of exotic birds, foxes in hunting poses, even pets preserved after death. Taxidermists made fortunes, their shops filled with glass-eyed creatures in lifelike stances. Some created whimsical scenes, kittens having tea, squirrels playing cards. Others specialized in realism, capturing the exact likeness of a beloved. Dog or horse, the work required chemicals, patience, precision. The taxidermist was part scientist, part artist, part undertaker. For Victorians obsessed with cataloguing the natural world, taxidermy was more than decoration. It was proof of conquest over death itself. The phrenologists. Now we step into the pseudoscience. The phrenologists claim to read personality from the bumps on a person's skull. By measuring curves and ridges, they said they could reveal a man's honesty, intelligence, even criminality. Phrenology parlors dotted London. Customers paid for readings, eager to know if their child was destined for greatness, or if a suitor was trustworthy. It was a mixture of theatre and false science, yet it shaped Victorian thought. Even prisons adopted phrenology charts. Today it is dismissed, but in its time it was a profession both profitable and influential. The fortune tellers. Beside them worked the fortune tellers. Some read palms, some gazed into crystal balls, some cast cards or bones. They operated in slums, on street corners, in back rooms lit by candle and smoke. The authorities often harassed them as cheats, yet people kept visiting. For the poor, desperate for hope, a fortune teller's words were worth. The coins. A girl might be told she would marry rich. A laborer might hear his illness would pass. Even if false, the comfort was real. The fortune teller's profession was survival, wrapped in mystery. The sin-eaters, strangest of all, was the old fading ritual of the sin-eater. Though more Welsh and rural than strictly Victorian, tales persisted. When a poor man died, his family laid bread and ale upon his chest. A hired sin-eater consumed it, symbolically taking on the dead man's sins, allowing the soul to pass clean. These men were despised, seen as cursed, yet needed. They wandered, ragged, half-feared figures, living off death. By eating, they became walking vessels of guilt. It was a profession born of belief, fading even as industry rose, but remembered in whispers, half folklore, half truth. The anatomists. And dissection rooms, and finally the anatomists. After the body snatchers, after the scandals, dissection became lawful under strict control. Medical schools employed men to prepare cadavers, to demonstrate anatomy to students. It was grisly work, cutting, preserving, cataloguing, but essential for science. In the public imagination, though, the anatomist remained a dark figure, his scalpel a symbol of cold curiosity. To the poor the fear lingered. To die in poverty might mean not rest, but the dissecting table. Closing of Part 9, so the Victorian shadows deepen. The mediums whisper with spirits. The death photographers pose the lifeless for memory. The professional. Mourners wail for wages. The gravediggers labor with shovels. The taxidermists give glass-eyed life to the dead. The phrenologists measure skulls. The fortune-tellers deal hope for pennies. The sin-eaters swallow sins with bread and ale. The anatomists cut and preserve, science rising on the bones of the poor. Each profession reveals how Victorians lived. With death, not in silence but in ritual, belief and trade. To them, the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and often negotiable. The candle-makers of memory. In the darker corners of the city lived the candle-makers, Candles weren't only for light, they were for memory, prayer, and ritual. A small flickering flame might stand in for an entire funeral. The craftsman would twist wicks by hand, pour melted tallow or beeswax, and sometimes mix in fragrances. The poor could afford only a plain stub of wax, while wealthy households ordered tall, perfumed candles wrapped in golden paper. The bell ringers. Then you had the bell ringers, whose job was basically to announce every joy and every disaster. Weddings, deaths, storms, plagues, all carried on the wind by the sound of iron bells. People could tell from the rhythm whether the city was celebrating or mourning. It wasn't just about strength to haul those heavy ropes. It was also about timing. On cold nights or in heavy rain, they still climbed up the towers, pulling until their arms ached. The bells were the heartbeat of the town, the watchmen of the night, and when everyone else was asleep, there were the night watchmen. With nothing more than a lantern and a wooden staff, they patrolled the empty streets. Their footsteps echoed through alleys, sometimes scaring off thieves, other times just reminding people that someone was awake and watching. A kind of living lullaby for the city, though probably not very glamorous for the guy pacing around at 3 a.m. The water carriers every city, no matter how grand, needed its water carriers. They walked the streets with buckets balanced on wooden poles, sloshing and dripping with every step. In places without aqueducts or wells, these men and women were basically the city's plumbing system. Poorer families bought just enough water for cooking or washing, while the wealthy could afford extra for baths or fountains. Imagine being half-soaked all day, smelling like a damp barrel, and still being indispensable. The rat catchers. Then there were the rat catchers. Not glamorous, but absolutely necessary. Cities were crawling with rodents, and rats meant disease. These men often carried cages, sacks, or even ferrets trained to chase vermin out of holes. The work was dirty, smelly, and dangerous, but it kept the plague at bay, or at least that was the hope. Some rat catchers even kept their prizes alive to show off like proof of service. Not exactly a dinner table career, the street musicians. And finally, let's not forget the street musicians. They weren't the polished court performers with lutes and harps, but rather everyday fiddlers, drummers, or singers who worked for a coin or two. Some were genuinely talented, others just loud. They played at markets, outside taverns, or beneath balconies, sometimes serenading, sometimes just trying not to starve. Their music was the background noise of urban life, half entertainment, half reminder that people would always find a way to make a little chaos sound like culture. The butchers, the barbers, and the bell ringers. Let's move softly now into another corner of the old city. The smell hits first, sharp, metallic, and heavy. That would be the butchers at work. The butchers were more than just meat, sellers. In most ancient cities, they worked out in the open. No refrigeration, no packaging, just carcasses hanging from hooks while flies buzzed around. And yet, everyone depended on them. People often distrusted butchers, whispering that they watered down the blood to make the meat look fresher, or shaved off the best cuts for themselves. And yes, occasionally someone would accuse them of selling something that maybe wasn't quite cow or goat. Butchers lived in that strange space, both necessary and slightly feared. The barbers next. Let's glide over to the barber's chair. Barbers in the ancient world weren't just hair cutters. They were also surgeons, tooth pullers, and sometimes amateur psychiatrists. Imagine walking in for a shave and walking out with a molar yanked and a leech on your arm. People trusted them with blades close to their throats, so why not let them poke around with a scalpel too? The barbershop became a kind of social club, a place to gossip, to complain, to catch up on local scandal, while someone fiddled with your hairline and maybe your arteries. The bell ringers, and then in the quieter corners we hear the bell ringers. Cities ran on sound. Bells told people when to wake, when to pray, when to work, and when to stop. The men, sometimes even children, tasked with pulling those ropes were like the city's alarm clocks. They climbed up high into towers, tugged on ropes thicker than their arms, and let sound roll over rooftops. It was hard work, sweaty work, and yet invisible. No one looked up at the bell tower and thought, "Ah, yes, that guy is keeping my day." Organized. But he was. The beggars, and of course we can't forget the beggars, they weren't jobs in the strict sense, but begging was part of the urban economy. In many ancient cities, beggars had their own unwritten territories, corners of markets, the steps of temples, the shadows of taverns. Some were genuinely destitute. Others, let's just say, they were professional. Cities tolerated them because giving alms was seen as good for the soul. So in a way, beggars provided a service too. They gave everyone else a chance to feel charitable, and so we float past butcher stalls, barber chairs, bell towers, and temple steps, each one another thread in the odd, endless fabric of ancient urban life. The butchers, the barbers, and the bell ringers all right, so here we are, wandering through another cluster of jobs that kept ancient cities humming, or at least staggering along. This time, we're brushing past the blood-stained aprons of butchers, the chatter-filled chairs of barbers, the quiet shadows of bell towers, and even the ragged hands of beggars. It's not glamorous, but honestly, that's the point. Civilization. Here's built less on kings and generals, and more on whoever was willing to scrape entrails off cobblestones at sunrise. The butchers. Let's start with the butchers. Now, in a modern city, you think of clean tiles, glass display cases, and neat cuts. Of meat. Ancient butchers, not so much. Their workplace was often the open street or the edge of a marketplace. Picture wooden blocks darkened with years of knife marks, blood running down into grooves in the stone, dogs circling for scraps, and flies forming their own buzzing kingdom above the carcasses. Customers didn't wander in with shopping carts. They walked up with baskets, haggled loudly, and often inspected the meat with their own hands. Smell, color, texture, all debated under the hot sun. And since there was no refrigeration, you bought it today because by tomorrow it would basically be soup. Butchers weren't just meat sellers. They were kind of a half-feared, half-respected caste. On one hand, they provided food. On the other, they were daily reminders of blood and death. Many religions considered them spiritually unclean, since they were constantly handling slaughtered animals. Yet ironically, temples often needed them too, for sacrifices, which made butchers socially complicated, useful, but a little suspect. And, yes, customers always suspected tricks. Was that lamb really lamb or something cheaper? Did the butcher shave off the best cut for his family and pawn the stringy leftovers off on you? It was a job full of sharp knives and sharper looks. The barbers. Then we drift down the street to the barber's chair. Now, the barber shop wasn't just where you went to get your hair cut. It was where you went to get your life cut into shape. In the ancient world, barbers were a strange mix of beautician, doctor, gossip columnist, and occasionally butcher-lite. You wanted a shave? Sure. A haircut? Easy. A rotten tooth pulled out with iron pliers? No problem. A boil lanced on your arm? Why not? And of course, leeches. Because why not double down on medieval science by slapping a worm on someone's forehead and calling it treatment? The barber's chair became a social hub too. Men especially treated it as the city's unofficial lounge. You'd sit, maybe get your beard trimmed while catching up on the latest scandals. Who was marrying who was sleeping with who, and which noble had completely embarrassed themselves in public this week. It was news, therapy, and minor surgery, all in one seat. And here's the funny part. People actually trusted barbers more than many doctors. Doctors charged more, used Latin words, and were generally seen as pompous. Barbers were cheaper, quicker, and didn't mind getting their hands messy. Sure, you might get an infection, but at least your beard looked sharp while you died of it. The bell ringers. Now let's climb higher. Past the rooftops, past the chimney smoke, into the cold air of the bell towers. Bell ringers were, in a strange way, the city's timekeepers. Long before wristwatches, and even before most households had clocks, you knew your day because the bells told you. Dawn, noon, evening, prayer time, curfew. It was all measured by sound, and bell ringing wasn't glamorous either. These weren't tiny dinner bells. These were massive bronze beasts weighing hundreds of pounds. To make them sing, you needed strength, timing, and sometimes sheer desperation. Pulling those ropes wasn't graceful. It was sweaty, back-breaking work. And the higher you were in the tower, the colder, windier, and lonelier it got. Most people never thought about the human being behind the bell. They just heard the chimes and moved on with their day. But the ringer was up there, bruised palms, sore arms, sometimes deafened by the sheer thunder of the bell in their ears. They were like ghosts, keeping the rhythm of city life, essential, invisible, and probably half-deaf by 30. The beggars and. Finally, we drift down from the towers to the cobblestones again, where the beggars wait. Now, calling this a job might sound cruel, but in the ancient world, begging wasn't just tolerated. It was built into the city's rhythm. Giving alms was seen as a religious duty. People expected to encounter beggars, and beggars expected to receive at least enough to survive. Markets, temple steps, tavern doors. Each corner had its own regulars. And yes, there were hierarchies even among beggars. The blind man at the temple might do better than the cripple outside the tavern. A woman with a child might earn more pity than a young man alone. It wasn't written down, but everyone knew. The unspoken rules. Certain spots belonged to certain beggars, and to trespass on another's corner could spark a fight as fierce as any merchant rivalry. And while many were genuinely destitute, there were always the professionals. The ones who knew how to dress down convincingly, or who could spin a tragic story with enough detail to melt a wealthy shopper's heart. They were, in their way, performers, and they gave others something too. A little daily moment of charity, a chance to feel generous. Cities needed them even if they pretended not to. So here in part 10 we pause among butcher stalls, barber chairs, bell ropes and temple steps. It's a strange picture of city life. Not kings, not heroes, but the ordinary hands that kept the whole organism breathing. The executioners, the prostitutes and the lamplighters, if part 10, had us drifting through butcher stalls, barber chairs and bell towers. Part 11 takes us into darker corners. Some jobs carried an air of dread, others a kind of scandal, and some were simply invisible until nightfall. These were the roles people whispered about, avoided in daylight, but couldn't live without. The executioners, few professions, carried. More infamy than the executioner. Imagine walking through a medieval town square, the wooden scaffold looming, the crowd pressing close for the spectacle. Everyone wanted justice, at least their idea of it. And at the center of it all stood one man with an axe, a rope, or a sword. Executioners weren't treated like heroes, though. Quite the opposite. People depended on them, but also feared and shunned them. They were seen as necessary, but cursed. Often they lived on the edges of town in houses nobody else wanted. Children were warned not to play with their children, and yet those same families were given food, land, or tax breaks to make up for their social exile. And the work itself, well, it wasn't as clean as history books sometimes make it sound. A beheading with a single stroke? That was rare. More often it took 2, 3, even 4 swings. Hanging wasn't instant either. It could mean long, choking minutes. And the executioner bore the weight of that failure in front of a baying crowd. Strangely, some executioners also doubled as healers. They knew anatomy, after all, and often they were called upon to set broken bones or mix crude medicines. Imagine that contradiction. The same man who broke necks by day might set your arm by night. Both feared and sought after. Their lives were heavy with contradictions. The prostitutes. Now, from the scaffold, we step down into the back alleys where another ancient profession waits in the shadows. The prostitutes. Cities have always had them, tolerated them, sometimes regulated them. For many women, especially the poor or the abandoned, it was the only way to survive. Taverns, brothels, bathhouses, and shadowed doorways all became their workplaces. Authorities often pretended to disapprove, yet quietly relied on the trade. In some places, brothels were licensed, taxed, even controlled by city officials. Better, they thought to contain the vice than to let it run wild. But containment didn't erase stigma. Respectable women crossed the street to avoid them. Priests thundered about sin, and yet the business never stopped. For the women themselves, it was a world of constant risk. Disease, violence, exploitation, all part of the daily gamble. But they also built networks, friendships, even a kind of sisterhood. Some became surprisingly wealthy, managing their own houses. Others sank into misery. It was a profession without middle ground, survival at its most raw, and the irony. Society looked down on them, while at the same time keeping them in constant demand. A contradiction that still lingers in whispers even today. The lamplighters. And then, when the scaffold was quiet and the alleys fell into silence, another figure emerged into the night. The lamplighter. Cities before electricity were black holes. After sunset, streets were dangerous, shadows alive with thieves and worse. But the lamplighter came with his pole, his ladder, and his slow, patient rhythm. One by one, he touched flame to oil, coaxing a glow into the darkness. It wasn't glamorous. It was cold, lonely work. The lamplighter moved from street to street, almost ghost-like, a shadow carrying light. Children sometimes followed, fascinated by the tiny miracle of each lamp sparking alive. But for most people, the lamplighter was invisible, just part of the city's breathing. And in the morning, he returned again, extinguishing each lamp, scraping soot, refilling oil. The cycle of flame and darkness depended on his quiet persistence. Without him, the city would have drowned in night. So here we rest at the scaffold, the alley, and the lamplit street. Jobs filled with shadows, necessary yet uncomfortable to look at too closely. And still, like every other role, they stitch the fabric of city life together. Picture this. It's market day. The square is packed, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, vendors pausing mid-sale. Everyone is waiting for the same grim event. The condemned man is led out, pale, stumbling, sometimes still shouting. And then, with all eyes fixed, the executioner steps forward. But he isn't celebrated like a hero of justice. No one wants to shake his hand after. They may cheer his work, but they won't invite him to dinner. He wears a kind of invisible stain. People whispered that executioners carried bad luck, that even their touch could spoil food or sour milk. And yet, when the city needed someone to swing the blade, no one else volunteered. And because of their unique skills, executioners often became the default experts in anatomy. They knew where joints met, where tendons stretched, where arteries ran. So after a public beheading, they might also be asked quietly to heal a neighbor's broken arm or craft a poultice for infection. Imagine being both the man who killed your cousin and the man who later set your broken leg. Strange duality. Some even passed their profession down family lines, generation to generation, because, let's be honest, no one else wanted the job. It was a heavy inheritance, but it kept food on the table. The prostitutes expanded. Now let's slip away from the crowd into the side streets. The air smells of smoke and spilled ale. The laughter is sharper here, mixed with whispered offers. Prostitution was often officially illegal and unofficially tolerated. City leaders quietly knew if they banned it, they'd lose control of it. So instead, they sometimes built entire red light districts, streets where brothels lined up like bakeries, each with painted doors or signs so customers knew exactly what was offered. Inside, the rooms were cramped, smoky with straw mattresses and dim candles. Some houses were high-class, decorated, with music and feasts for wealthier clients. Others were little more than a bare room behind a tavern. Life for these women was brutally hard, but also strangely layered. A few became powerful madams, controlling large businesses and making money hand over fist. Others used their savings to eventually buy their way out, even marrying respectable men who pretended not to know their past. But for many, the story was bleaker. Cycles of poverty, disease, and abandonment. And the city's hypocrisy showed through clearly. Sermons thundered about sin on Sunday, but on Saturday night, half the congregation had been wandering those alleys. The lamplighters expanded. Finally, when the noise of the square dies down and the alleys go quiet, another worker appears, barely noticed. The lamplighter. He carries a long iron pole tipped with a flame. Step by step, lamp by lamp, he leans forward and touches the wick. A sudden glow spills out, chasing shadows back into doorways. He moves on, methodical, steady. It's not glamorous. His clothes smell of oil and smoke. His hands are scarred from burns, and yet in a way the lamplighter held the city's safety in his hands. Without him, every street after sunset would be a hunting ground for thieves. Every returning traveler would stumble blind through the dark. Children sometimes followed him like fireflies, giggling as each light came alive. Lovers might thank him for keeping their evening stroll safe, but most people ignored him. He was part of the background, seen, but not celebrated. And at dawn, he walked the same path again, extinguishing each flame, scraping soot, topping up, the oil repeating the cycle. Day after day, year after year, his work was never finished. It simply flowed like breathing. So in one night you might glimpse three kinds of lives: the feared executioner at the scaffold, the scorned prostitute in the alley, and the invisible lamplighter moving from street to street. All different, yet all essential pieces of the city's strange rhythm. Entertainers, jesters, astrologers, and scribes, the street entertainers, imagine walking through a bustling Roman or medieval market. Among the stalls of bread, fish, and cloth, you hear the faint pluck of a lute or the rhythmic beat of a small drum. And then, there they are. Jugglers tossing wooden balls, acrobats flipping in dusty courtyards, and storytellers weaving tales in exchange for coins. They were the background soundtrack of the city, half ignored, half adored. Some were brilliant, gathering crowds who clapped and laughed. Others were desperate, repeating the same trick again and again while people hurried past without a glance. These entertainers lived hand to mouth. One day you might make enough to buy bread, cheese, and cheap wine. Another day you might go hungry, sleeping in the stable behind the tavern. It wasn't glamorous, but it was better than breaking stones in a quarry. And at least they had one thing: freedom. They didn't answer to lords or guilds, just to the crowd's attention. The court jesters now, court jesters. You'd think their life was all laughter and silliness. In truth, it was one of the most precarious jobs imaginable. The jester had one duty: speak truth wrapped in comedy. He was allowed to mock the king, tease nobles, and say things no one else dared, but it was a razor's edge. If the king laughed, the jester lived. If the king didn't, well, best not to imagine the consequences. Some became confidants of rulers, almost like unofficial advisors disguised in fool's clothing. They saw politics up close, sitting in on councils, making jokes about tax policy that secretly carried sharp meaning. Others were little more than human toys, used and discarded, yet in the flickering candlelight of medieval halls, their laughter carried power. And perhaps in their own way, jesters were the freest people at court. The astrologers, now let's step outside again and tilt our heads upward. The night sky in ancient cities was darker than ours, no electric haze to blur the stars. Thousands of bright points glittering above, each one full of mystery. And into that mystery stepped the astrologers. They charted the heavens, tracked the movements of planets, and told kings what the stars meant. Should you go to war? Wait for Venus to align. Should you marry your daughter to that duke? Consult the stars. Even emperors who commanded thousands of soldiers trusted a man with ink-stained hands staring at the sky. Some astrologers truly believed in their craft. Others knew it was a performance, part science, part poetry, part manipulation. But either way, they held influence. If you could whisper to a king, "The heavens bless your rule," you'd never go hungry. And sometimes the predictions were vague enough to always be right. A great change is coming. Sure, it always is. That's the trick. The scribes finally, the quietest of city workers, the scribes. While jugglers juggled, jesters joked, and astrologers looked up at the stars, scribes bent over parchment in candlelight. They copied laws, recorded debts, preserved poetry, and made sure kings had written proof of their victories, whether those victories were real or not. In ancient Egypt, scribes were a whole class of their own. They didn't swing hammers or plow fields. Their tool was the reed pen, their battlefield the page. But the work was grueling. Hours of tiny strokes, bent posture, ink stains on their fingers. Their eyes strained, their backs ached, and yet through their work entire civilizations were remembered. Without them, the voices of pharaohs, emperors, and poets would have been lost to time. They weren't glamorous. Most people didn't even notice them. But their quiet persistence gave history a memory. So in the same city, you could find all of this: a juggler flipping knives in a dusty street, a jester risking his life with a joke, an astrologer whispering cosmic advice to a ruler, a scribe silently copying another man's words in the flicker of lamplight. Each of them, in their own way, shaped the rhythm of the city. The musicians and troubadours. If the jugglers were the background noise of the market, musicians were its heartbeat. In medieval towns, you could find a wandering troubadour with a lute, singing about courtly love, usually to people who had never actually experienced courtly love, or a fiddler at a tavern, bow scraping across strings while drunk patrons stomped, their feet and spilled ale everywhere. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was news. Many troubadours composed songs about political events, scandals, or noble marriages. Imagine the medieval version of a gossip column, but with a melody. Did you hear? The Duke of Aquitaine is broke again. Let's make it rhyme. And pass a hat around. And unlike jesters, musicians could move between worlds. They played for peasants at fairs one day, then for lords at feasts the next. Always on the road, always chasing coin, always hungry. But wherever they went, they carried stories in song. The professional mourners now? Here's a strange one. Professional mourners. In many ancient cities, Egypt, Rome, even parts of medieval Europe, wealthy families hired people to cry at funerals. Yes, cry loudly, dramatically. Tear-stained faces, torn garments, wails echoing through the streets. It was a performance of grief. The louder the mourning, the more important the deceased seemed. And if you couldn't produce enough authentic sobs, well, you could always fake it. Many mourners were skilled actors who could produce tears on command. Imagine walking past a funeral procession and hearing a chorus of exaggerated wails, not from the family, but from people paid by the hour. To us it feels absurd. To them it was a mark of respect. The fortune tellers in a corner of the market under a ragged tent sat the fortune tellers. Palms outstretched, cards shuffled, dice rattled. Some used bones, some used smoke, some simply stared hard at your face until you believed they saw your future. Were they con artists? Many, yes, but they offered comfort in a world full of uncertainty. Life expectancy was short. Wars were frequent. Disease lurked everywhere. People wanted reassurance, even if it came from the vague mutterings of a stranger. A fortune teller might tell a farmer's wife that her son would grow strong and prosperous. Maybe he wouldn't, but for a brief moment, hope was worth a few coins. And of course, fortune tellers knew how to flatter. You are destined for greatness. Always a crowd pleaser. The teachers and philosophers, every ancient city had its thinkers. Some taught children letters and numbers in noisy classrooms, wielding sticks for discipline as much as for pointing at chalkboards. Others, if you think about it, modern cities aren't that different. Just replace the prophet with a man holding a sign on the subway and the wandering eccentric with someone live-streaming conspiracy theories. Human cities have always made room for the odd, the unusual, and the fringe.